So my department was, I guess as I said earlier, kind of indifferent to it. My academic advisor, her background is in hacker culture, so she kind of got it.
She's like halfway there already.
Yeah, only for her it was more about like, the political economy of hacking and all of that stuff. So she wasn't really that into audience study and the whole.
Now, when you say audience study, can you say a sentence or two?
Yeah, so audience research is the practice of understanding what people think, feel, and how they interpret what we call texts. So it started way back in like the 1940s and 50s when, trying to understand why people were interested in radio programs and television programs and how they digested all of that information and all of that stuff.
So you would just sit with people and you'd like flash lolcats and be like, how does this make you feel? How does this make you feel? That's your process, right?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Actually, it wasn't that dissimilar. I did focus groups. And so I sort of would ask, I screened a bunch of people based upon their usage habits and whether they were interested in lolcats and, how in-depth they were. And then sort of ask them, how do you use these things? Like, how do you interact with them? When do you interact with them? Like, what is it about them? To try and understand, like, what is it, like, what happens when people interact with lolcats? And why do they do it? Like, what's the underlying motivation? Like, what do they derive from it? So,
what's the answer?
It all depends on who the user is. So
there's not just one answer?
There is not just one answer. The short answer is, has to do with identity and establishing in-group boundaries. So there were 3 different user types that came out of my thesis. So there were what I called the cheese friends, who are the people who hang out on I Can Has Cheeseburger, who speak in LulzSpeak, hang out on the Cheesetown Crier. I'm sure that you, so the Cheesetown Crier is like a community site outside of Cheeseburger where everybody speaks in LulzSpeak all the time. And it's really interesting, actually. Like, they would send me emails in LulzSpeak and we would converse in LulzSpeak, because if I were back to them in English, that was considered rude. So there were the cheese friends, and then there were the meme geeks, which was not meant pejoratively at all, but is sort of like this crowd, like people who are really into internet culture. And then there were the bored at work folks who kind of were like, oh, cats, yeah. So the way that their relationship to lolcats differed based upon who they were. With the cheese friends, it was all about community and like being part of a community. And LulzSpeak was actually the tool that they used to establish in and out group boundaries. So the way that you spoke lol determined how high ranking you were in that community. And then with meme geeks, it was all about the genre, like the actual format. Like, did you get the impact font right? Like, how many intertextual references can you layer onto this thing? Like, how obscure is it? The more obscure, the cooler you are. So all of that. And then with the Board at Works folks, it was just kind of like, oh, I like cats, and my coworkers send them to me, so it's fun. So it just, and I think that makes lolcat slightly different than like other image macros, really, because, well, I could talk like, I'm just gonna.
We'll get there.
We could get there anyway. So yeah, that was
okay.
So audience research. So they didn't really, like, no one knew what it was. They weren't that interested. They kind of didn't care. They're like, yeah, you can do your thing. Like, that's fine. Most people were doing, more hard-hitting stuff, like how do AIDS patients, in third world countries, interpret, community media, and how do they, act out their, alternative reality through that. Like, that's the kind of stuff that people in my department were doing. So I was like, yeah, lolcats.
Okay, so we've got departmental support, departmental ambivalence, and Whitney, I think your story's a little different.
Everything has been so weird from the very beginning. I mean, and I have to say that probably that has benefited the project more than anything. And it's sort of like the project was sort of brought into the world by the letters N and O, that constantly being challenged and constantly being told that this was not acceptable, it forced me to be resourceful and to go where people would be supportive. So, my home department didn't necessarily know what to do with the project, which isn't to say that they weren't supportive, but they just didn't know, and so couldn't really give much feedback or respond to it. So you find people who can. You go I worked with, I aligned myself with Folklore, who's been amazing. And they're sort of kind of they're affiliated with English, they're under the English umbrella, but they're their own sort of entity too. So I worked with them, and I worked with people in JCOM, and I worked with people in women and gender studies. I worked with whoever would work with me, and from all those different people was able to sort of take different sets of tools and basically post hoc the entire thing. In order to say what I need to say, what do I need? Who has those things? Let's go there. With total disregard to what was a normal project for English or a normal project for, JCOM, I had something to do. And so you just take what's there. And so it's been really fun and exciting actually reaching out and I don't know, creating sort of bridges between maybe disparate disciplines. And that's what's been the most fun and that has held a fire under my ass like nothing else, because it means that, you can't just fall back on the tools that you're handed. If they don't work, you find more tools. So it's been exciting and really hard. It's given me, it was lots of headaches and probably an ulcer or two, but it also, it keeps you on your toes. So I think I've been sort of lucky in that I wasn't immediately embraced by the people who were, I guess, there to embrace me. So I've had a great time.
Being shunned by the way.
Well, it's not exactly shunned. You can't really blame them though. It's a weird project, and it's sort of not unpalatable, but if you don't know what you're looking at, it just looks horrible. And so being able to translate that and trying to find a language so that I can say, this is what I study, and this is why it matters to a whole range of people has been really, really helpful, because it forces me to always be aware of the fact that most of the people I talk to won't know what the hell I'm talking about. That burden is on me. It's not their fault for not understanding. It's my duty to sort of translate it in a way that seems relevant to lots of different people across the academy. And so I feel like I've gotten training in a lot of different spaces, which is cool.
Actually, so we're working towards another point then, I think. So you guys all sort of talked about why do memes in academia, right? You each have your different reasons. But what if we flip that and we say, why apply the techniques of academia to memes? So Whitney, you just mentioned sort of some of the tools that you can bring to bear. So what are some of the things, right? Because there isn't a lot of internet troll theory out there right now. What are the theories or the tools that you found in casting about that are actually useful for you?
Folklore has been amazing in a lot. So one of the, specifically discussions of disaster humor. So a lot of trolling, you can talk about it from this perspective of how do people respond to and make stuff with the terrible things that happen in the world. This is not new. Nothing that trolls do is new. It's packaged in a different way, and it's disseminated in a different way, and it gets a certain kind of cultural visibility, in part because of then the media's intervention. They throw their hands up and they raise a fit, and then that just brings it more attention. So
yes, the trollers, yes.
Right. So you have all these different sort of amplifying factors, which probably changes it from where it was 30 years ago, but people were still making the same kinds of horrible jokes 30 years ago. It's just that it was restricted to the living room. So you look at the work that people have done previously, because humans don't really change all that much. It's just, maybe the medium changes. So there's tons of people who've been working on humor and working on sort of transgressive behaviors and subcultural behaviors, and all of those theories are really, really important and very, very helpful in explaining how it is that this group of seemingly inexplicable people actually fit really well into, it fits into the academy very well. We've been talking about it for generations, basically, and so, folklore's been great. A lot of, like I said, subcultural stuff, a lot of stuff about moral panics has been really helpful. So pretty much, there have been some exceptions, and I have, of course, pulled from digital humanities people. Biella Coleman's work has been amazing, and hi. So there are people who are in this space and doing great stuff, but I've actually found that the older tools have been surprisingly more helpful than I think I was worried about at the beginning. Because it was like, how do you theorize trolls? No one has really presented a theory of trolls academically. So, I was scared when I first started, but it's actually not been that hard. And in fact, it's been so easy to sort of utilize those resources. So, it's sort of like memes belong in academia, and academia belongs in the memescape. It's not very different than what's happened previous to this.
You can't imagine it otherwise.
Yeah.
Kate, you already talked a little bit about audience studies. Is there anything else that really...
So the interesting thing for me is that in my theoretical framework for my master's, I actually didn't really use any audience research stuff.
Just threw it right out.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing an audience study, but there were so many other things that I was interested in that, like, in the 12,000 words that I, like, the limit that I had, I couldn't, it wasn't really that useful. Like, it was useful from a methodological perspective, but not from an actual theoretical perspective. So, I drew, like, I took two separate tacks. One was sort of contextualizing user-generated content and using a lot of Henry Jenkins' work, for all you MIT people, like CMS. Woohoo! Yeah, I'm a huge Jenkins fan. And also looking at the work on looking at creativity and like examinations of creativity. A guy named David Gauntlet talks about everyday creativity and the way that people now, like Web 2.0, sort of allows people to express those things. But in looking at actual, like the lolcats themselves, what was really helpful was humor. Again, looking at I read, I think probably a lot of the same disaster humor stuff that you did. The way that humor sort of, as a social tool, kind of constructs things, and then genre theory, like actually looking, like using from English, like text and all of that stuff, and how that acts as a boundary and all of those things. So I kind of was all over the place. Like there isn't any one place to go for lolcats. Like where do you even start with that? And you know, my academic advisor kind of was like, well, you could do this, but I mean, it just depends on what you want to say. So that was kind of, that was a really difficult thing for me actually. So, but it was great because I read a ton of different stuff. I was all over the place.
Well, now, Jordan, I would guess linguistics being more science-y, if I can use that not real adjective,
Of course.
would maybe actually have a narrower literature. Was that the case? Is there like, 2 or 3 linguistic things that are the most important?
That's pretty interesting to ask. As far as
Is that totally wrong?
I don't know.
All right.
I do know that my experience was kind of like Kate's, where I was looking all over the place for stuff. I found a theory, and I used grounded theory, and that worked for me. Grounded theory is basically like, get the data first, and then see what the data says. Don't be like the scientist that does the data beautification and then comes up with a hypothesis first and says, I'm going to see if this is like this, and then you find out it's not, and then you try to make it like that.
So you're saying the first thing you did is grab as many lolcats as possible?
Yes. Well,
how many ballpark have you read?
Like 20,000?
20,000?
Well, what I did is I went on Aca-meme-ia's cheeseburger, and I wanted to get like every 40th one. I didn't want to do it by random. I wanted to have like a chronological order, that way I could see if there was any difference between the first one and the last one. I ended up with like, I think 98, because I looked through it for about 2 years, and I just kept clicking. It was like 1, 2, 3, 4, next page, 5, 6, and that's what I did for a time that I want to forget about in my life. But what I also did is I looked at, on JSTOR and WorldCat, and I typed in lolcats and lolspeak, and not surprisingly, there was nothing there. So I had to go out into the real world and the media, and I found newspaper articles, but a lot of them were tiny little things like, hey, there's this strange thing on the internet called lolspeak. Yeah, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, like that's all I got.
Right, and I was like, well, I can't write my entire thesis on just that. And there was a guy named Anil Dash, I'm not sure which, but he's speaking here later today, or is in something later today, and he wrote this article on lolspeak, and he talked about what it was, and he wanted to really know, and he's not a linguist, and he's not involved in it in any way, except that he found it, and he's like, hey, this is cool and fascinating. What is it? Why don't we talk about it? So I kind of used that as my gateway, and as I continued researching, there were more things that came out about memes and about lolspeak, like Kate's article. And so I just kind of went from there, and towards the end of my thesis, it was more that there was starting to get generated a lot of stuff to where I would say, okay, like I'm finishing my thesis in a month. I can't include more citations. I can't include more articles. This is great, but where were you last year? So that's kind of what I did is I went all over the internet and searching and went to all these different places, and my thesis advisor would suggest things, well, look up the Foreigner Talk by Charles Ferguson, because LOLspeak is kind of like a non-native English, so why don't you talk about it as that, and then go over here and talk about it as this, and that's kind of what I did.
What was the theory that you used? Did you bring in like motherese and doggerel and all of that stuff?
A little bit. I talked about it because from what I know, which is difficult to pin down the exact origin of LOLspeak, is that it did come from Happy Cat. But there are some theories that Happy Cat was a Russian cat food ad. So in a way, it really did come from Foreigner Talk. So I went through it that angle.
Nice. Now I'm gonna curveball, or do you got a follow up?
I have one
Whitney.
really quick thing. I also wanted to just acknowledge that there was work on trolls before. I mean, I certainly wasn't the first person to do it, and I owe a grat of gratitude.
That's exactly how you said it.
I owe a grat of
That's
gratitude to, there were lots of people in that space writing interesting things. Viella did some stuff, the Chanthropology Project. There was stuff out there, so it's not like I was working all alone. There were lots of people who informed my thinking. It's just that, it wasn't necessarily immediately recognizable to many academics. So I just want to make sure that I give credit where seriously credit is due, because lots of people are very smart doing stuff before I did, way before I did, and a lot of stuff that's smarter. So thumbs up and thank you. That's all.